A very good evening to you. I am Lisa Lord, and my special guest is the chairman of the National Advisory Committee to guide the establishment of a commission for improving the lives of persons with disabilities, Mr. Edmund Hinkson. Mr. Hinkson, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. Thank you for having me, Lisa. Good evening to Barbados. And, I'm honored by the opportunity to speak directly to the people of Barbados on this program.
And we're honored for having you. Thank you so much. Now, let's begin by looking at the work of this committee, which was established on June 1st. Give me some background. What's your mandate, the makeup of the committee in terms of your members, etc.?
Okay. Well, the Cabinet of Barbados established this committee. It was launched on the 1st of June this year with the mandate to, within 6 months, by Independence Day this year, deliver a draft policy on disabilities to improve the lives of people with disabilities. Also to submit, and this is to our parent ministry, the Ministry of People's Empowerment and Elder Affairs, a draft Rights of Persons with Disabilities Bill. And thirdly, to establish the framework through which a commission can be established, which will treat to issues dealing with people with disabilities and complaints by people with disabilities. Now, this is an extremely significant step by the Cabinet of Barbados. It is the first time in our history that a cabinet has had the political will to say, look, a serious legislative defect in our country is our failure and lack of direct legislation dealing with people with disabilities and giving them rights. Because people with disabilities, of course, are citizens of Barbados, entitled to the full rights of citizenship, entitled to fully participate in all aspects of society, just like everyone else, are entitled to be included in all aspects, whether it's employment, whether it's socially, culturally, politically. They're entitled not to be discriminated against, just as any other citizen has constitutional rights which prevent discrimination on the basis whether it's, gender, sex, religion, sexual identity, orientation. People with disabilities have those constitutional rights, human rights, which are basic. They have the right to equal treatment before the law and have the right to access of all of Barbados, the natural and man-made environment. And we don't have any set legislation dealing with these issues. So it is quite honestly a tribute to Prime Minister Miamo Motley, who at the opening of, at least the swearing in of ministers and members of parliament, you would recall at State House after the election, spoke about the imminent establishment of the committee, that I would be chairman of it, is something we've spoken of, and which was in fact announced by the then Her Excellency the Governor General in September 2020, but only now established in June. And tribute to Minister Kurt Humphrey, who is, of course, Minister of People Empowerment, who is shown his commitment to it.
But how do we define a person with a disability?
Well, the proposal in our law, and we have a draft bill already on rights of persons with disabilities, and that bill, in fact, has been drafted by Dr. Jason Haynes, one of our leading young academics, legal academics in the Caribbean, Vincentian born, married to a Barbadian, and the Law Reform Commission, headed by Sir David Simmons, recognized that we have a serious legislative defect in our system by not having disabilities bill. The Law Reform Commission retained Dr. Haynes to draft the bill. And the definition in that bill reflects the definition in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which in fact defines a disability, a person with disability, to include those with long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in their interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. That's the international definition. And you will see that from that definition, it says includes. So that means that the categories of persons with disabilities is not closed. But you will see that it encompasses everything, not only the physical, obviously people with mobility challenges, the mental, and that's a growing concern among obviously our people with autism spectrums, and clearly with an aging population in Barbados, people living longer. The longer you live, the more likely it is to get dementia and Alzheimer's. And we know about that. I certainly know on a personal basis, my father had it for the last 6-7 years of his life. It speaks to the intellectual, sensory impairments, people who are blind, people who are deaf, but the categories are not closed. And we have put in a lot of work in just over 3 months already in working towards fulfillment of our mandate as given by the cabinet. We initially started out by meeting with all the ministries of government, because each and every ministry of government impacts on persons with disabilities. So we met with some by themselves. I mean, clearly education, health, transport would be major, and we met with those by themselves. So others we combine with each other because it's interlocking. And then we met with all the organizations serving people with disabilities. There are 21 of those, including associate organizations. We met with them on 3 occasions, both in person and by Zoom. We've met with the UN agencies in Barbados because, of course, they have a fundamental aspect to play. I mean, as it relates to development, people with disabilities, and children, UNESCO. We also met with the social partnership, the members of the social partnership, Labour and the trade union movement, as well as the private sector and business. Within the next week, we will meet with the Bankers Association, the credit union movement. We're meeting tomorrow with the Social Justice Committee, Friday with the faith-based organizations. We have reached out to the opposition political parties in Barbados, and they have accepted our invitation to meet with us as well, and those meetings will be within the next 2 weeks as well. So we're going very wide. In addition to that, of course, we've invited and we've written Pacific organizations, all of them that have a history and tradition of serving people with disabilities, and asked them to submit memoranda to us, where there's the Lions Clubs, of which I'm a life member now, the Rotaries, Kiwanis, Salvation Army, Optimist, BAM, Bar Association, all of them have been, the Homeless Society, all have been written, inviting them to submit memorandum, and we hope that they take us up on this opportunity. Our email address is inclusion@barbados.gov.bb. And we've invited the general public. The ads are going on consistently to submit memorandum. In response to your question as to the composition of the committee, it is equally divided, essentially, in terms of gender, as well as in terms of persons with disabilities and persons who have an interest through close family relationship with persons with disabilities. So the deputy chairman is former president of the Senate, Miss Kerry Ann Ifill, who everyone knows, I mean, tremendous individual. Also on it is Miss Janelle Odell. I mean, really and truly, you can't get better than Janelle.
Right,
First
great young
class
lady.
honors in
Yes.
law. degree, blind, first class honors in law, master's degree, first blind attorney at law in Barbados. We also have Mr. Granville Carter, who is a 6 successive time Calypso champion of the blind, the competitions held for blind persons. We also have Senator Andrea Lee Boyce. The senator is, again, an extremely fine individual. Of course, he has a disability, as we know. Hasn't stopped him from getting 2 university degrees and going on, including a law degree. We have as well Ms. Joanne Haig, who you know very well, who, as we know, has a child with disabilities. And we have Mr. Larry Smith of Queen's Counsel, and he has a son with disabilities, autism. And we also have Miss Sonia Rollins, who also has a child with disabilities, and she also is head of the administration manager of the Derek Smith School and Vocational Center, which, as we know, caters to persons with disabilities, a fantastic school in Lears. So these are the members, and of course, Mr. John Hollingsworth, who is director of the National Disabilities Unit. He is also on the board. The National Disabilities Unit serves as the secretariat for our committee. And of course, I am the chairman.
In your opening, you started talking about a range of rights that persons in the disabled community should have. However, in 2022, we know that they do not have many of them. And it starts with our children who are disabled. I had the president of the Barbados Down Syndrome Association, Miss Asha Aline Renwick, who's doing a phenomenal job pushing awareness in terms of Down syndrome on the island. And she said that one of the major hurdles has been the integration of these children into mainstream educational institutions. We've been hearing that from the time I was in school. That's been a while ago.
Yeah.
What is being done in the area of education?
Okay. So let's give the background to this whole scenario. The United Nations, of which, of course, we are a member, one out of 196 countries, in 2006 would have enacted a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities. We signed that convention in May 2007. We're a signatory to this convention. In February, just after the election, which brought me into Parliament, February 2013, we ratified that convention. So there's no political divide on the issue that there is a dire need to improve the lives of persons with disabilities, because this convention speaks to all aspects of the lives of people with disabilities. You will see, as I said, from those 2 dates, 2007, 2013, both political parties have signed on. Now, in international law, when a country ratifies a convention, it has an international duty and moral obligation to domesticate that convention. So we're in breach of our international obligations over the last 9.5 years, having ratified that treaty. So first thing, we have a legal right, a legal obligation at international level to bring into effect rights of persons with disabilities legislation. Now, and that's what we're seeking to do. Now, in terms of education, education is fundamental. We know that education has been the means by which Black people in this country have been able to rise socially and economically. Without that, where would we be? But the reality of the situation is that even though for 60 years we've had on our statute books the right to free education by everyone between ages 4 and now 16. Before it was 14, change in 1976 from 14 to 16, and even though, of course, we started the framework and the movement towards free education of children from the 1950s, the reality is that many children with disabilities in this country do not access free education because, as you said, they are not entered into mainstream school because of the facilities maybe don't accommodate them at every school, even though recent schools built do have some accommodation for them, but clearly the previous schools don't. They might have difficulties, obviously, in terms of their toilet training, bathroom training, and therefore they have to go to special schools. Derek Smith School, which I mentioned, Sunshine School off Robert Street in Perry Gap, and other similar schools. And even though, yes, we have been very fortunate, and I here wish to commend some of the international philanthropic foundations that serve us, like the Maria Holder Trust and the Sandy Lane Trust, and you know, these organizations do assist in subsidizing the school fees of some of these children.
It's not enough.
These children should have this as of right, as the law of Barbados has said for over 60 years. And the reality of the situation, as we know, is that most children with disabilities come from poor, disadvantaged homes. That's a fact in Barbados. And even those children with disabilities who come from better off homes, I mean, you know, their parents are able to cope, obviously, in terms of the school fees. But there are a lot of children with disabilities from poor families that have difficulty, therefore, accessing education, paying these fees, because they're not able to go to mainstream schools, which have not been able to accommodate them. So this is something that fundamentally we have to look at. We're, as you know, dealing with education reform now as we speak. I believe that the submissions are before the Prime Minister for her review. Is not only an issue of abolishing the common entrance exam, which we ought to have done a while ago, in my opinion, but it is other issues. So therefore, a policy such as examining children at age 4 on entry into school to see if they have a disability, whether it's dyslexia, maybe hearing problem.
But you also need specialist teachers as well.
Well, and a lot of, we have trained specialist teachers, but in a lot of cases, and the Ministry of Education has said they're not really accommodated, though, to teach persons with children with disabilities. And this is something that the Ministry of Education has pledged during our meeting with them to have a look at. So these are some of the issues. We know that when our Prime Minister was Minister of Education, there was a policy for examining whether a child at age 4 or 5 had dyslexia and other issues that prevented it developing his or her learning skills. Clearly, the Ministry of Health and Wellness would have to be involved in such a policy. When we raised this issue during our meeting with the Ministry of Education, they said that they are looking to bring back in that policy next school year, in other words, the school year beginning 2023. When we met with the United Nations agencies, they agreed on principle that this is such a serious area. UNESCO said that they would assist in this regard, whether it's with technical assistance or financial. So we trust that this is an area that would be pursued. But clearly within the draft bill that we already have and the policy framework which we will propose and submit to the ministry, we have issues about how we will tried to equate now equal rights of children with disabilities as with any other child, which is fundamental, because that's the basis. If a child is not able to access all the full opportunities of education, they're going to fall behind in terms of employment and clearly other areas of life.
You just mentioned falling behind in terms of employment. That's something that I want to stick on. The last population census in 2010 highlighted that 90%, not 90% of persons with disabilities of working age were unemployed.
You are exactly correct, Lisa. And that's a point that I emphasize every meeting that we have had. Because that 90%, and quite honestly, I don't think that the present census that we're doing now, undertaking, will show much of a difference. It's perhaps about 90%. When I said it was 90% at one of the meetings with persons with disabilities, a blind individual said is more than 90%. But yes, the figure in 2010 showed it was 90%. At that time, the census said that about 5% of the people of Barbados had some form of disability, 14, 15 odd thousand. And 90%, as we know, represents 10 times the national norm of our unemployment rate among people with disabilities. It is something that we can't be proud of at all. As Mahatma Gandhi said, a country has to be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable. And if we have a situation where it is acceptable to some people that 90% of people of working age adults with disabilities can't find a job, and that includes people who have vocational training, people who have university degrees, something is fundamentally wrong. And that's what this committee is about. That's what the Cabinet of Barbados, the executive, has said, no, this has to stop, and we have to find a better way. So therefore, the public of Barbados, this country, has to treat to certain issues, whether one, for example, there should be affirmative action in terms of employment of people with disabilities.
Is it a case that employers are still not comfortable having a person with a disability in their workplace?
Well, when we met with the private sector business people, they agreed on principle that this was wrong. The issue will be in some cases whether the physical infrastructure of the business can accommodate people with disabilities, and we say it ought to, because in my submission, in a lot of cases, a person with disability who has brain, there might be mobility challenge, nothing has affected their brain. They're going to work better than a person without disability, I will bet, in most cases, because having been given that opportunity, they're not spending time during the day on WhatsApp, on social media, gossiping, like maybe some others might be doing. They're going to treasure that opportunity. And business people who have given persons with disabilities an opportunity in terms of employment will invariably tell you that these persons have worked well and produced. So the issue, of course, as I said, though, is that a lot of buildings that we have do not accommodate persons with disabilities. Let's face fact. In terms of bathrooms, for example, workstations. So we have to look to see whether there can be consensus that business places will have to retrofit to employ persons with disabilities. Clearly a time frame would have to be given for that. But the issue is people with disabilities have to be given a chance, because God forbid any of us could meet in an accident on any given day. Your back might be injured, your legs might be injured, your brain is still good. But we have had a policy in Barbados for years that after a year, whether you work in government, especially government workers, you're off because of a temporary disability. It might be temporary too, caused by an accident. You're off for a year. You're put before a medical board under the National Insurance Scheme, and they might board you and say you have a disability and you're no longer employed by government. But that can't sit well with any right-thinking person. You then go on a disability benefit, which is perhaps 50% of your original salary. So what's that? How are you supposed to live and survive? But in addition to that, you're still a useful member of society in terms of brain and intellectual capacity. But the government, which, as we all know, has to reform our national security scheme, has to find money still to pay you a disability benefit every month, which isn't sufficient anyway. So, I mean, it doesn't make sense in terms of the economics or in terms of the intellectual.
And I want to stick on that point about opportunities, because I heard all you talking about the retrofitting of the business places, etc. However, earlier this year, the Barbados Council for the Disabled circulated its own manifesto during the general elections campaign. And the point was made that during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was proven that persons could work effectively from at home. Why can't that be done for persons of the disabled community? It is logical in some instances.
That's an extremely important point, fundamental point, because COVID, you always say, boy, you have to still make the best use of adversity. And COVID has shown us that people could work remotely at home. So there's nothing, absolutely no reason whatsoever why someone with mobility challenge, disability, blind person even, can't work from home. Well, I mean, they have blind people who are much better at information technology and computers than I am or than most people who can see. I mean, the two, Kerianna and Janine, you see them on computer IT, amazing. So it's a question of opportunity, and that's what people with disabilities are making.
Yeah, that's the point I'm making. Access to healthcare.
Well, that is a fundamental issue. So again, it has to be a human right that a person with disability can access healthcare just like any other person on an equal basis as any other citizen. So persons with disabilities, yes, have raised issues with access at the polyclinics. And simple issues. Let me give an example. Deaf. You're deaf, you're at polyclinic. Apparently, okay, they might call your name when it's time for you, your turn. But you're deaf, so you don't hear. And deaf persons have complained about that there's no system then to let them know that it's their turn. I mean, these are challenges that can easily be solved. We're looking at prosthesis, for example. The issue is that as well, that in a lot of cases, you may be able to get duty-free waivers on devices, assistive devices for persons with disabilities, but it isn't as of right. And you go through difficulty, let's put it that way, in terms of getting the waivers from the Ministry of Finance. And when we spoke with the Ministry of Finance, Minister Ryan Strawn, he accepted that is a challenge, and they have pledged to review that, see how it is easier.
When we were discussing education, you pointed out that the Ministry of Health had a role to play in terms of the specialists intervening at an early age and determining whether or not a child has perhaps a learning disability. But we know that many parents have to pay private specialists, which for many might be very expensive. So how has the Ministry of Health come on board? Because I do believe you've met with them already, as you've mentioned,
Right.
to say what assistance they will render.
Yeah, you're exactly correct. That has been raised at our meetings with people with disabilities. As I said, it's a fact that most of the children with disabilities come from homes that are disadvantaged economically. So it's a problem. Look, this is not going to be an overnight fix. It has to be for the long haul. The ministry has been made aware, and as I said, we'll be making policy proposals on these particular issues. And the draft bill has sections as well, and clearly issues of health will also be part of the draft bill. And before, of course, we send the bill and policy to the ministry, we will invite all the stakeholders to a meeting. Sir David Simmons, who is chairman of the Law Reform Commission, has undertaken that will be done in terms of looking, letting everyone know what we're proposing in terms of the law. So everyone would have the opportunity to say, but we're, as I said, trying to get as wide a view from the whole of Barbados, because this has to be an all-of-society approach.
Disability benefits across the board have been a concern. They're not enough, and not all disabilities are covered by these benefits. There's also the concern that because of the severity of some disabilities, some persons need around-the-clock care. Therefore, the caretaker is not in a position to work, and they too should benefit as well.
You've again raised some fundamental issues that challenge the daily living of people with disabilities and people who look after them. We all know that we're looking at national insurance reform now as a matter of priority. The reality of it is that there has been no change in the law for persons with disabilities accessing benefits of whatever form since the National Insurance Act came into force in 1968. I think in most aspects there hasn't been any fundamental change of the legislation. But certainly for people with disabilities, this is an issue because we know that the categories have expanded in that time. So it is only the blind and the deaf without speech who get disability benefits as of right. So if you are deaf but with speech, in other words, if you may have become deaf then later on in life, when you had learned to speak already, you do not get any benefit as of right. And this is a serious problem.
Yes.
The practicality of it is that our welfare system has come into play. And in a lot of cases, people with disabilities still do get some benefit, but that means an application to the welfare system. And it isn't as of right. Or it might be a case like a lady last year who asked for my assistance, whereby the internal framework of the National Insurance denied her daughter a benefit her daughter had multiple sclerosis, and she then had to appeal to a tribunal within that system of the NIS, Disabilities Benefits Tribunal. And the tribunal thankfully gave her the benefit. Didn't have to. It wasn't within the law, but they used their discretion to give her the benefit. So these are issues that we confront.
We've seen the Transport Board retrofitting a lot of their buses, but in many cases, the problem of transportation is far from fixed.
Yeah, you're correct, and we're thankful to the Ministry of Transport for realizing that persons with disabilities have to be accommodated. So as we know, all the electric buses that have come in over the last 2 years, and I believe there have been close to 50 of them now, have capacity to transport one person with mobility challenges. There's need for more. This policy needs to go on. Again, when we met with the Ministry of Transport, and I must say that all of these ministerial meetings, ministers essentially attended. And, so they realize the importance of leading their ministry's response on the issue of reform to accommodate and improve the lives of persons with disabilities. And the ministry recognized, there's a challenge, and that we need to do better. Obviously, access to the built and man-made environment of persons with disabilities. So issues of, for example, ensuring that Bridgetown is accessible to all persons with disabilities, whether blind, mobility challenged. Again, the Ministry of Public Works Transport has started it, and we're thankful to that. I believe there are 4 now spaces in Bridgetown reserved for persons with disabilities. And this is after, and this ought to have been a simple fix. In 2015, I think it was, over 10,000, maybe 12,000 persons signed a petition, presented to the then government for parking spaces in Bridgetown. Took 7 years before it could happen. And this is a fundamental problem. Up to this morning, and in this case, this was a constituent of mine, said, Ms. Dixon, I'm totally frustrated, because you have law now since 2017 saying that persons without disabilities should not park. That is against the law for them to park in spaces reserved for persons with disability. The fine is only $500. And I had told the then minister that was too low. He in fact publicly said that, I said it was too low, but yet nothing was done. $500 is a joke. But yet no one is prosecuted for doing that. And people do it all the time. Parking, they don't have any disability, and parking in a space reserved for persons with disability, whether it's a shopping center or mall or whatever. And even when they're told, the response is negative. So the law has to be enforced. It has to be a situation where we have to urge people to make these reports on people take the license number, etc. And some people have to be prosecuted because there's no use having the law and it's broken, it's fulfilled in its breach. But this goes to the whole aspect of sensitivity and awareness of the public. That's one of the overriding problems that we face in Barbados, that a lot of Barbadians who do not have disabilities really, unfortunately, don't seem to care about people with disabilities.
I'm going to come back to that point.
Okay.
The disabled community are amongst some of our most vulnerable.
Yeah.
Access to adequate housing
Yeah.
is also a problem that plagues the community. You have landlords refusing to rent persons with disabilities, and then those that are gainfully employed and perhaps want to purchase a property, the financial institutions are not that willing to work with them. But I know you did mention that you have been having meetings with the financial institutions. The area of housing.
Right. Thankfully, and again, let's give the background. In 2000 May, a green paper was laid in Parliament on persons with disabilities to improve their lives. And that green paper, in fact, said as a policy outline that 10% of state housing in Barbados should be reserved for persons with disabilities. All right, and obviously their close families. A white paper was subsequently laid just over 20 years ago in Parliament in August 2002, essentially now confirming and expanding on the Green Paper's policy. So we have not had a policy on persons with disabilities for the last 20 years. So that's the context. The Cabinet of Barbados recently passed, agreed that 10% of state housing in Barbados would be reserved for persons with disabilities and their family. And this would include houses that are built in association with the private sector, government land, for example. So this, quite frankly, is transformational. The Minister of Housing, Honourable Drake Sutherland, would have mentioned it in Parliament even before, as I understand, Cabinet made the decision formally. He subsequently mentioned it at a mortgage fair that took place in Freedom Square in Bridgetown. So the question, though, is implementation of this policy and to realize this policy. So it's going to need continuous registration of persons with disabilities, and that requirement or that provision will be in the Disabilities Act whenever passed, no doubt, is in all our sister CARICOM nations' Disabilities Act, because the authorities need to know then who are persons with disabilities and your categories of persons with disabilities to be able to assist and help. So it's not going to be a question of invasion of privacy, but we are going to need to know that. Right now, there's a process by which you could register with the National Disabilities Unit, and we urging people to do that. As we know, our new Trident National Identification Card is out, and there's provision for a person with disability to say that they have a disability. They had some issues with it initially, but when we met with the Chief Electoral Officer and some of her officers, they expressed real willingness to resolve the teething issues that we've had with that. It may entail some persons who already would have given information on, to get their Trident card to go back, and arrangements are being made with, for example, the deaf for that to happen or all in one, so that they can register that on their card, because clearly there will be benefits as well from registration as a person with disability.
And it is critical information.
And it's critical, of course.
Now, one of the mandates of the committee which you head is to raise public awareness. Your first town hall meeting was last week. Tell me about the next two that are coming up.
Okay. Well, the next one will be this coming Wednesday at the Ivan Harewood Centre, Christchurch Parish Church, because the first one, of course, was in the city, and this one in the south of the island. So this coming Wednesday will be at Ivan Harewood Centre, and then the following Thursday the 29th, would be Alexandra's School in the north. I certainly have already sent out dozens of the flyers to my constituents in St. James North, and virtually to all the persons with disabilities or their family, urging them to come. It's in person, and it's also virtual if you can't make it in person. But it is a direct opportunity to speak to person, to the committee members on the issue. I believe Minister Humphrey would be in attendance as well. Parliamentary Secretary Corey Lane, he attended all of the meetings with the organizations serving people with disabilities, and there's also facilitation for our diaspora to contribute. And we've sent notice through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to all of our missions and embassies overseas, asking them to distribute the details of the Zoom facilitation to, Barbadians and Barbadian diaspora so that they can also tune in.
Now, before you became, and I'm getting personal now, Edmund Hinkson, the politician, you've always been Edmund Hinkson, the champion for the rights of persons with disabilities. You've been doing this now for about 30 years. If I do stand corrected, you can let me know. But your interest in terms of championing the rights of persons with disabilities started because of your sister who's deaf. I don't know if you want to go into some details in terms of your
That's correct.
involvement.
My sister Celia, 5 years younger than I am, so obviously we grew up together, was born deaf in England. And from the time I was young, I think, I decided early o'clock that I wanted to be a lawyer. And secondly, to help people with disabilities at the basic level, as well as nationally, if possible. And quite honestly, I don't know that I would have gone into politics, elective politics, but for my desire to help people with disabilities. So this opportunity that has been given to me, I think I regard as the culmination of my elective political involvement. Of course, my constituents, come first still, but this cause is something I have been involved with for over 30 years. That's why I joined the Lions Club of Bridgetown, because that club would have established the Irving Wilson School for the Deaf, of which my sister was one of the first students there in 1968. And I would have gone to school at now Wilkie Commonbatch, was then New Pine Primary, in the same compound. And as Edwin O'Neill, trade union rep, remembered, we had a laugh on that when we met with the trade union movement, because he was at school too with Wilkie, and there was no separation between the children with disabilities and us at Wilkie. We all played together at lunchtime. So this has been because I of course served as a director of the Council for the Disabled when I was an opposition MP, and that's part of my life. So, everyone must volunteer, and I think everyone has the obligation to try and leave their country in a better position in some way than how they found it.
In your position, you too have been ridiculed for your speech impediment.
I'm a politician. My back is broad. If your back is not broad, if you're thin-skinned, you would not get into politics. Yes, I have encountered over my life, from the time I was at school, people who would mimic how I speak. I don't know that there is anyone who does not understand every word that I say. Where I was very disappointed was when I was an opposition MP and two government ministers on separate occasions mimicked how I spoke, or one of them said something about speaking English, and I was extremely shocked. I know that people in the community of disabilities reacted, and this is nothing to do with politics. You just don't do those things.
Right.
How I speak has never stopped me in any way, and if there's some people who feel that how I speak is a disability, so be it. Hasn't stopped me from reaching the top of my profession, reaching the top of politics, 3 times elected, serving people with disabilities, and in numerous other organizations at leadership level. So people like that, but that is part of the need to sensitize people in Barbados that perhaps in a way everybody has, well, there's no one who's perfect. Let's start with that premise. Secondly, that anyone can get a disability at any time in life if you live long enough. And the prevalence of diabetes in our country,
Hypertension.
your likelihood that your leg
lose a
might get
limb.
cut off, you might become blind,
Yeah.
you meet in a car accident, you have a disability, so it is sad. But that's the reality, and part of our mandate has to be to sensitize, and again, that sensitization process will continue after our mandate ends on Independence Day. It has to, because that is fundamental. And as I said, 5% of the population of Barbados, and it's perhaps more now. It was 5% 12 years ago. So we have to understand, be more understanding, recognize that people with disabilities have every human right that anybody else has. They have the right to work. They have the right to go out. So, some Bajans who might tell a blind person who to see in a supermarket, what are you doing here? Why you ain't at home? They got that right like you. They have the right to take part in the cultural activities of Barbados. Like I said, we need an all-of-society approach to this challenge.
We have come a long way. There's still a lot of insensitivity. However, we don't hear about instances of persons being locked up in the house like in years gone by, but we still have a way to go.
That is correct. Yes, I suppose when I was young, I used to hear about that. I think we all did, about people being locked up.
Yes.
So therefore, when they had a census, the census might not have correctly in previous years reflected the amount of people with disabilities. But yes, I think that there's greater appreciation for persons with disabilities. As I said, the whole issue is opportunity. Because believe you me, given opportunity, and the opportunities have to start with education, clearly, and that leads to employment and obviously health. And in terms of employment, everybody can work in government, whether you have a disability or not. So it has to be a case where incentives have to be given to the private sector, for example. Perhaps that's an issue that we have to discuss, to employ people with disabilities. Because in some countries, in Europe, France, for example, you employ 50 people, your business, at least one has to be a person with disability. And it's not tokenism, it is a qualified person with disability, of course, who is worthy, 100, perhaps 2 or 3. And as I said, that has to be on the table in terms of our going forward with policy and law. Whether you're going to have that quota system, as I said, for not tokenism, but for worthy, qualified people with disabilities. Jamaica has had it for a while as a matter of policy, that 3% of all government jobs have to go to persons with disabilities. And since their law, it is now 4%. And as I said, these are the kind of policy or legislative initiatives that a country that, such as Barbados, which punches above its weight in terms of the international community, has to make in terms of some of its most vulnerable people, of which people with disabilities fall into that category.
Well, Mr. Hinkson, thank you so much for all you're doing and have been doing over the years. You and your team on the committee still have quite a lot to do before November 30th. We wish you the best of luck, and we are happy to assist wherever possible.
Yes, I thank you, Lisa. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure as well, sir. Thank you so much. That was Mr. Edmund Hinkson, the chairman of the National Advisory Committee, which will look to guide the establishment of a commission for improving the lives of persons with disabilities. I am Lisa Lord. You are watching One on One. Do have yourself a wonderful evening.